In January 2026, millions of previously sealed documents related to Jeffrey Epstein were released to the public. This massive release, far exceeding previous disclosures, contained extensive evidence, names, flight logs, financial records, deposition transcripts, emails, and disturbing details about a network that spanned decades. The headlines focused on the names: politicians, billionaires, celebrities, academics. The public reaction was predictable: shock, outrage, demands for justice. But here's what the mainstream media largely avoided asking: how did this happen? Not just how did one man commit these crimes, but how did an entire system enable, protect, and profit from it for so long? Today, we're going to analyze the Epstein case through a Marxist lens. And I want to be clear from the start: this isn't about the crimes themselves. This is about the system that made them possible. This is about how capitalism doesn't just allow this kind of abuse. It creates the conditions for it. If you're new to Marxist analysis, don't worry. I'll explain the concepts as we go. But by the end of this video, you'll understand why socialists argue that cases like Epstein's aren't aberrations or bad apples. They're features of a system built on exploitation and the concentration of power in private hands. First, let's talk about what these millions of documents actually show. The sheer scale of this January 2026 release is unprecedented. We're not talking about hundreds of pages anymore. We're talking about millions of documents that paint a comprehensive picture of how this network operated, who was involved, and how it was protected for so long. The released files confirm what many already suspected. Epstein's network included some of the world's most powerful people. We're talking about former presidents, British royalty, Silicon Valley executives, leading scientists, and Wall Street billionaires. The flight logs show repeated trips to his private island. The depositions describe a coordinated system: recruiters, enablers, lawyers, and financial managers, all working to maintain the operation. But here's what's crucial for our analysis. The documents also reveal the mechanisms of protection. We see how Epstein's legal team, comprised of some of the most expensive attorneys money can buy, worked to suppress evidence, intimidate victims, and negotiate favorable plea deals. We see how his wealth allowed him to settle cases quietly, to donate to influential institutions, to maintain relationships with powerful people who could protect him. In 2008, Epstein pleaded guilty to state charges and served just 13 months in a county jail with work release privileges. This was for crimes that should have resulted in decades in federal prison. His victims described a justice system that treated them with skepticism while treating him with deference. The files show pattern after pattern: victim testimonies dismissed or ignored, law enforcement investigations that stalled or were shut down, media stories killed before publication, institutions that continued accepting his money even after allegations surfaced. Now, the mainstream narrative focuses on individual corruption: bad prosecutors, complicit enablers, moral failures. And yes, individuals made terrible choices. But Marxists look deeper. We ask, what systemic conditions made all of this possible? What structures allowed one person to accumulate enough wealth and power to operate with effective impunity for decades? Because here's the thing: this isn't unique to Epstein. The same pattern repeats across capitalism. The wealthy face different legal consequences than the poor. Money buys access, influence, and protection. Private wealth concentrates power in ways that undermine democratic accountability. Let's break down exactly how this works. To understand this from a Marxist perspective, we need to cover some foundational concepts. Class under capitalism. In Marxist analysis, society is fundamentally divided into classes based on their relationship to the means of production. That's factories, land, technology, capital itself. The capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, owns these means of production. The working class, the proletariat, owns only their labor, which they must sell to survive. But there's more to it than just economics. This class divide creates a power imbalance that permeates every social institution, including the legal system, media, education, and government. Epstein represents an extreme example of capitalist class power: his wealth. Estimated at over $500 million, wasn't just about luxury, it was about power. The power to hire the best lawyers. The power to make donations that gave him access and influence. The power to threaten, to settle, to make problems disappear. Here's where it gets important. Marxists argue that the state under capitalism, the government, courts, police, all of it, isn't a neutral arbiter of justice. It exists primarily to protect property relations and maintain the capitalist system. The law applies differently depending on your class position. Think about it. When poor people commit crimes, they face the full force of the justice system. Public defenders with overwhelming caseloads, harsh sentences, brutal prison conditions. But when the wealthy commit crimes, financial fraud, environmental destruction, labor violations, they face fines that amount to cost of doing business, deferred prosecutions, settlements with no admission of guilt. The Epstein case makes this crystal clear. His 2008 plea deal, negotiated in secret with the U.S. Attorney's Office, gave him immunity and protected his co-conspirators. His victims weren't even informed of the agreement, a violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act. The prosecutor who arranged this deal, Alexander Acosta, who later became Trump's labor secretary. This isn't a bug in the system. From a Marxist perspective, this is the system working as designed, protecting the interests of the capitalist class. Marx wrote about how the ruling class controls not just the means of production, but also the means of mental production, the ideas, narratives, and institutions that shape how we think about the world. Look at how Epstein cultivated relationships with prestigious institutions. He donated millions to Harvard, MIT, and other universities. He sat on boards. He funded scientific research. Why? Because these relationships provided legitimacy, access, and protection. When allegations surfaced, these institutions were slow to respond, hesitant to return donations, careful not to damage relationships with other wealthy donors. The media, too, operates under capitalism. Major outlets are owned by billionaires or corporations. Advertisers hold influence. Legal departments worry about lawsuits from the wealthy. Stories about Epstein were reportedly killed or delayed by editors concerned about legal exposure or advertiser relationships. This is what Marxists call ideological hegemony. The ruling class doesn't just control through force, but through controlling the institutions that shape public consciousness. Here's the crucial point. Under capitalism, massive private wealth equals massive private power. And private power is, by definition, unaccountable to democratic processes. Epstein could move between countries freely on private jets. He could hire former law enforcement and intelligence operatives for security. He could maintain private islands and multiple residences. He could pay for silence through settlements and NDAs. His wealth gave him a degree of autonomy from social accountability that most people can't imagine. This is what socialists mean when we talk about the contradiction between capitalism and democracy. You can't have true democracy when a tiny number of people control vast resources and can use that control to escape accountability, shape institutions, and influence the systems that are supposed to regulate them. So how would socialist organization prevent or address these kinds of abuses? Let's be specific. Under socialism, the means of production are collectively owned. This doesn't mean everyone makes the same amount. That's a common misconception. It means that major industries, financial institutions, and productive resources are democratically controlled rather than privately owned for profit. Without the ability to accumulate hundreds of millions in private wealth, you eliminate the financial power that enabled Epstein's operation. No private jets to avoid scrutiny. No ability to hire armies of lawyers to intimidate victims. No money to donate to institutions for legitimacy and protection. Marxists argue that extreme wealth concentration isn't a reward for merit. It's extraction of surplus value from workers' labor. By reorganizing production democratically, we prevent that concentration in the first place. In a socialist system, major institutions, universities, media organizations, research facilities, wouldn't depend on wealthy donors for funding. They'd be publicly funded and democratically accountable. Imagine if Harvard didn't need to worry about alienating billionaire donors. Imagine if media outlets were worker-owned cooperatives or public trusts rather than profit-driven corporations. The structural incentive to protect the wealthy disappears when institutions aren't dependent on their money. This doesn't mean socialism prevents all abuse. We'll address that shortly. But it removes the specific mechanism by which wealth translates into institutional protection. Under capitalism, the legal system reflects class interests. Public defenders are chronically underfunded while corporate law firms bill thousands per hour. The wealthy can afford to litigate endlessly, while the poor often can't afford any representation. A socialist approach would guarantee equal access to legal resources as a right. Prosecutors wouldn't be appointed by and dependent on politicians who receive donations from the wealthy. Judges wouldn't come predominantly from corporate law backgrounds. The entire orientation of the justice system would shift from protecting property to protecting people. The 2008 Epstein plea deal happened because prosecutors prioritized the interests of a wealthy defendant over the rights of victims. Socialist legal frameworks would structurally prevent this by removing the class bias built into prosecutorial discretion. Here's something the files revealed. Much of Epstein's operation depended on secrecy, isolation, and victims' lack of resources or social power. Socialist organization emphasizes collective power and democratic transparency. Workers organized in unions and councils, communities with real decision-making authority, victims with institutional support rather than having to navigate the system alone. When power is collective rather than concentrated in private hands, abuse becomes harder to hide and easier to address. When people have economic security and aren't dependent on individual wealthy employers, they have more ability to come forward without fear of retaliation. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, but won't people abuse power under any system? Isn't this just human nature? Here's the Marxist response. Human behavior is shaped by material conditions and social structures, not fixed human nature. Yes, people are capable of terrible things under any system. But capitalism specifically creates conditions that enable and protect certain kinds of abuse. When you organize society around profit accumulation and competition, when you allow massive wealth concentration, when you make institutions dependent on the rich, you create structural conditions for abuse. Changing those structures doesn't create perfect people, but it removes the specific mechanisms that currently protect abusers. And yes, socialist societies have had their own problems with abuse of power. We're not claiming perfection. But those abuses came from different structural conditions: bureaucratic power, party hierarchies, lack of democratic accountability. The Marxist analysis says we need to address all forms of concentrated, unaccountable power, whether economic or political. The goal isn't to replace one form of tyranny with another. It's to create structures of democratic accountability that apply to everyone, regardless of their position. So let's bring this back to where we started. The Epstein Files are horrifying. The crimes detailed in those documents represent unconscionable abuse. The suffering of his victims deserves recognition, justice, and support. But from a Marxist perspective, these files reveal something beyond individual criminality. They expose the structural relationship between wealth, power, and accountability under capitalism. They show us how concentrated private wealth translates into institutional protection, how legal systems treat the rich differently than the poor, how major institutions become dependent on and complicit with the wealthy, how money can buy silence, influence, and effective impunity. None of this is accidental. It's not a failure of the system. It's the system functioning according to its class logic. When socialists argue for collective ownership, democratic institutions, and economic equality, this is exactly why. Not because socialism prevents all abuse. No system can promise that. But because socialist organization removes the specific mechanisms by which wealth protects power and power escapes accountability. The question isn't whether individuals are capable of terrible things. The question is, what structures enable or prevent those things? What systems protect abusers or empower victims? Under what conditions can justice actually function? The Epstein Files give us an answer. Under capitalism, with its concentration of private wealth and class-based institutions, justice bends toward those with money. The system protected him until it couldn't anymore, and even then, he faced consequences only after decades of abuse, multiple investigations, and persistent advocacy from victims who the system initially dismissed. That's not justice. That's not accountability. That's class power in action. A better world is possible, but it requires us to look beyond individual bad actors and confront the systems that enable them. It requires us to imagine and build structures of genuine democratic accountability. Economic, political, and social. The Epstein Files are a damning indictment, not just of one man, but of the entire system that made his crimes possible and protected him for so long. That's the real story. That's what we need to understand. And that's why we need fundamental systemic change.